Welcome, everyone, to today's Archives Alive lecture, Pauline Johnson and Her Archive, a conversation with Dr. Rick Monture. I'm Jillian Dunks, one of the organizers of the Archives Alive series, which is a partnership series between McMaster University Library and the Alumni Department. I'm speaking to you today from Mississauga and Haudenosaunee territory. Today's lecture is going to focus on Six Nations of the Grand River, as this was Pauline Johnson's home community. And in this context, we'll be discussing Haudenosaunee sovereignty and governance. Given this, it's worth pointing out to you some of the treaties that are relevant to this land, and you probably saw, some of them on the slide. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and allied nations to peaceably care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes, and also the Two-Row Wampum, a treaty agreement that the Haudenosaunee made with European nations in the 17th century. The Two-Row Wampum establishes a separate but equal status between nations, meaning that the nations who are party to the treaty recognize one another's sovereignty and do not interfere with one another's affairs. The Two-Row Wampum is a living treaty that persists to this day. If you're joining us today and you're not familiar with some of these treaties, I encourage you to spend a little bit more time learning about them and to really reflect on how they impact your life in this territory. Now it is also my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Rick Monture. Dr. Monture is a member of the Mohawk Nation Turtle Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. He is Associate Professor in the Departments of Indigenous Studies and English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. His areas of academic interest include Haudenosaunee history and oral narrative, American and Indigenous literatures, popular music, and the epistemology of Indigenous languages and culture. Dr. Monture's book, entitled We Share Our Matters, 2 Centuries of Writing and Resistance at Six Nations of the Grand River, explores how the Grand River Haudenosaunee have consistently drawn upon their intellectual and cultural traditions in letters, oratory, poetry, fiction, and film as a means to assert and maintain their sovereignty and land rights, as promised by the Haldimand Deed of 1784. Rick Monture has been involved with several joint research initiatives between McMaster and Six Nations, and is the current holder of a Shirk Award for a community-based project entitled The Six Nations Struggle for Sovereignty, 1924 and Beyond, which examines the events leading up to the federal government's dismantling of the centuries-old traditional government that presided at Grand River until October 1924. So just to touch on some housekeeping matters before we get started, Dr. Monture is going to provide a brief opening lecture to frame our discussion, and then I will be asking him some questions, including some of your pre-submitted questions about Pauline Johnson and the archival records at McMaster Library. The session will be recorded. If you have a question, please submit it using the Q&A section of Zoom. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well, but if I don't get to all of your questions there, I'll follow up with you via email at a later date. With all that being said, why don't we get started? Thanks so much, Rick.
Thanks, Jillian. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see, well, I don't see you, but I did a quick scan of folks in the online room here, so good to see some familiar names if I can't see your familiar faces. But yeah, I just want to say thanks to Jillian and the archive, and Mills Library has always been very supportive of all things Indigenous, and my own career at McMaster over the years. So I've been kind of home away from home in many ways. Libraries have changed a lot everywhere, but Mills still feels very familiar most of the time for me, just because there's such a... Libraries used to be a place of reading and quiet. Now it's kind of a social hub, but that's okay too. Anyway, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about Pauline Johnson today. She's from Six Nations, obviously a notable figure. I think most people probably are aware of her in some capacity. I'll do a quick overview of her life and things. And Christine has a PowerPoint. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, it's kind of weird being on Zoom because it took a long time for all of us to get accustomed to doing Zoom presentations and chats and meetings and stuff. And now we're kind of the other end of things, hopefully. So now it's kind of weird being back in that space. I've lost my comfort and my rhythm of doing a Zoom presentation now that I'm back in the classroom. So I have to readjust my muscle memory is not what it was. But and I'm driving a new laptop, test driving a new laptop today, so that's why I'm not in control. But Christine will work the PowerPoint for me. We won't get into the tech aspects of that. But anyway, all that to say is thanks everybody for coming out on your lunch hour. Zoom has been good because it allows people to be a part of this without having to actually physically be on campus. And that's more and more of a chore every day for those of us who do come on the campus with parking, construction, everything else. But anyway, it's good to see everyone. So Pauline is, like I said, very well known in these parts. She's from Six Nations, born and raised, lived the first third of her life or so, born in 1861 on the banks of the Grand River and Chiefswood Estate, Chiefswood Mansion that her father built in 1856. It was made a National Historic Site in 1953, just because it's architecture style. It's an Edwardian architectural style. We'll get to that in a bit in the PowerPoint. But just that she's from a notable family, a notable community, and had a lot of political and social exposure to things happening on the reserve. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, sort of 19th century social and political environments at Six Nations. And I guess the context of the times in which she did her work, and from her position as a Mohawk woman with an English mother, the political things that she navigated, the social things of being a woman, being an Indigenous person, being an Indigenous woman, all very complicated things for her time. And she did a remarkable job. And we often, those of us who discuss Pauline and talk about Pauline and remark about, like, she's a very compelling figure. She's still a mystery to most of us. And that's good because it keeps the conversation alive, right? It keeps her interesting. She's not some sort of relic from the past. The things that she talked about and wrote about and felt passionate about are things that we're still talking about now, 160 years later, since her birth, at Six Nations and elsewhere amongst and within a lot of Indigenous contexts. There's a lot to discuss, a lot that she took up, a lot of things that are still unresolved. So I'll just, Christine, if you could please go to the next slide. That was a notable picture of Pauline. The profile, it was always kind of her right side, seemed to be her preferred side for the glamour shots. And there's a lot of those. Here's another publicity photo. I like this one that shows her other side, very defiant, kind of, I think, very tongue-in-cheek, it seems to me, these images. Nowadays, we're so inundated with photos of each other and ourselves on our cell phones. It's such an easy thing to do. But back in her time, of course, 1880s, this probably would have been taken. Photos were a pretty expensive, big endeavor. You couldn't just sort of casually shoot things. Everything was set up in a studio and this and that. So very performative, right? But I like this one. It seems to me her sense of humor a little bit. Strike a noble, Mohawk woman pose or something. But what's also, and there's her dates, below 1861 and 1913. But what's also interesting is this dress, her stage attire, let's call it. I often tell my students she was sort of like the Lady Gaga or Madonna or Beyonce of her time, Taylor Swift now, I guess. Very popular, in that time, the 1880s, 1890s was kind of the height of her touring career, a little bit into the 1900s. But so she had to play the part, right? So what we have here is kind of a mixture, a mishmash, if you will, of various indigenous accoutrements, right? The bear claw necklace, the wampum belt, which I'll talk about a little bit, hanging off her belt. Her little beaded purse looks to be of an Anishinaabe beadwork, the fringe, the kind of things that a non-native audience would expect of a native woman at that time. Didn't have a basis in reality, just a whole bunch of things thrown together. But it spoke the part, right? That's what people expected of her, along with the nose and the profile. And think about these times too. Touring, there was no PA, no speakers, no microphones. It was just her on a solo on a stage, projecting as best she could for those times. She spoke Massey Hall in Toronto. For instance, a big stage back in those days was recently constructed. Still in operation today, which is fantastic. But places like that and much more smaller rooms as well. Next slide, please. And of course, she was also noted for the second part of her presentation. So she would come on. I'm not exactly sure how long her performances were. I'm guessing somewhere half an hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour back in those days. Not entirely sure, but the whole thing was she would read her quote unquote native poems in that regalia before that I just shown. Um, they were poems highly politically charged in many ways. Cry from an Indian Wife, The Cattle Thief, the Corn Husker, those sorts of things that people know that are very native based in their content, and some of the very, activists in its tone for back in those days. Again, the 1880s, 1890s, a much different world than we live in today. So after intermission, she would come back out in this very Victorian dress, to kind of literally, I guess, and figuratively, metaphorically, let's say, kind of transform herself into the fine Victorian woman of the age, and read more of her Canadian poems. Those things that were kind of the song My Paddle Sings, I would imagine, perhaps would be read while wearing this dress. But things that were more Canadian, sort of patriotic Canadian nationalism, environment, things of that nature. If people are familiar with her work at all, what she would probably do at that point. And again, I would say pandering is probably not the right word, but working an audience, right? Kind of giving them the expectation of a Native woman, strong Native woman, reading these, performing these poems. They're poems written for performance in mind. They have a kind of rhythm to them, and saying some pretty powerful things for back in those days. And then kind of afterwards, a sort of, I don't want to call it assimilation, a performance of assimilation, but it might have had that impact in that audience. Might not have been her intent, but for that time, that's probably what was conveyed to an audience, that a Native woman can do those things, but now things are changed where they're progressing in their ability to assimilate and in fashion, in speech, in content, to kind of get with the program of being Canadian. And again, we have to also think about the realities of her situation, which I'll get into a little bit. But at this point in her career, she was in her 20s, early 30s, needed to perform to make a living. She was supporting her mother and her sister, and herself, of course. And, one could not bite the hand that feeds or make people feel uncomfortable. So it couldn't have been a performance full of political commentary, calling attention to social injustices of the day, that kind of thing. She'd have to sort of play it down the middle. So I imagine this was her way of doing that, accomplishing that. Selling tickets, probably kind of the priority a little bit. Next slide, please. Here's one that you probably, most people, if you're on this call, you're probably somewhat familiar with Pauline and kind of her whole shtick. This one I like, always the right side. There's the right side again in profile. She's a young woman, a canoeist, right? So she's ready to jump in the Grand River in her canoe and paddle away. But this is kind of a bit of a rarity. This particular pose and photo just sort of shows her engaging the things that she loved, being on the river, being in control of her own vessel, let's say. Song My Paddle Sings arose out of this, but it's a nice little image, just something you don't see all the time with her. A different side of her, let's say, not the performative one, but well, obviously I think every picture back then is a performative one, maybe. Like I said, it had to be staged right in the studio, but nice carved wooden paddle, says a lot too. But I just include this for variety's sake. Next slide, please, Christine. So here's her house. This is the house I mentioned earlier, that her father, George Johnson, built in 1856. So if anyone's familiar, I realized I probably should have sent or included a map for those who aren't familiar with the area, but the Chiefswood home was built on the north shore of the Grand River along Highway 50, what is now Highway 54, kind of right between Brantford and Caledonia, pretty close to the road. Highway 54, although it's a provincial highway now, is probably quite likely a very ancient footpath that paralleled the river for years and years and years. So it would have been a very highly traveled area, even pre Six Nations arriving in 1784. But anyway, so he had a little bit of wealth at that time. He was a chief and an interpreter for the Six Nations Hereditary Council, which was the traditional council at Six Nations for the last 1,000 years until 1924, when it was taken over by the RCMP and Indian Affairs in Ottawa. But we'll talk about more about that later. But this is the house that he built. As I said, it was designated a National Historic Site in 1953. There's a marker there erected by the province to celebrate the life of Pauline a little bit. That home is been restored a couple times, most recently in 1988, and again a bit more recently. I sat on the Chiefswood Board of Trustees for years and years to kind of oversee the upkeep and all of that. The home was in great shape. They built things to last back then, so her home reflected that. Like I said, her dad was George Johnson, an affluent Mohawk chief and part of the governing council at the time, and her grandfather, George's dad, John Smoke Johnson, his name was a War of 1812 veteran who knew Joseph Brant. So, and John Smoke Johnson was very much alive and well in Pauline's early lifetime. And so she got a lot, she was very close to him by all accounts. So she got a lot of material from him, stories, language, all of that stuff would have came directly from a very credible source, very respected fellow her grandfather was. So a lot of that grounding that she had in the culture and the history was, like I said, she would have known that stuff. And the other interesting thing, which is what a map would have been helpful, but as I said, he built this home. It's two-sided. Can you quickly go to the next one, Christine, please? This is the backside. This is the south side that faces the Grand River. I'm sorry, that's the best image I could find really quickly last night. I apologize, but you get the idea. It's a mirror of the front. So basically, George's intent there was to have two front entrances to his home. One that faced the reserve, which would have been this side that faced the river, the rest of the reserve, and the other north-facing side, basically the non-Indigenous community. The other significant thing there is that just about a half a mile or a kilometer or two from where the house still sits was the old Six Nations Council House that was governed by the Confederacy Chiefs, of which John Smoke Johnson and George Johnson were a part of. And that old council house was the meeting place where all the political things were taken care of, and all the visiting dignitaries and politicos from non-Indigenous Canada or Upper Canada at that time would have met our traditional chiefs and clan mothers in council. Right up until 1863, when the council house was built in Ashwaubenon, the village of Ashwaubenon, on the south side of the Grand River this time. So kind of making that double entrance a bit outdated, I guess, because there wasn't as much political traffic happening. The symbolic nature of it was lost a little bit at that time. Go to the next slide, please. So there's the council house. As you can, I think you can maybe see, hopefully you can see in the PowerPoint, 1863. Still standing in the village of downtown Ashwaubenon, and was constructed by Six Nations individuals, still standing, still in great shape. We're refurbishing that now. So that's where the council house was. So this is where a lot of political activities, like I said, Pauline was born in 1861, so she was a couple years old when this council house was built. And that was the political center of Six Nations from that time. And think about it, 1863, 4 years before Confederation, 13 years before the first big Indian Act, I suppose, where things started to begin to really drastically change for Indigenous people and folks at Six Nations. And it was a tumultuous time into which she was born. Like I said, her dad was well connected politically and culturally. Her grandfather was still around. So this was a time of great change, with the Indian Act on the horizon, Canada asserting its authority now, and Six Nations trying to find its, I guess, voice or positionality in regards to Canada. We had, as Jillian said at the outset, the Turo Wampum established our relationship as Haudenosaunee people with the British Crown in the 1600s, in the 17th century. So some 200 plus years before this, we had this long-standing relationship with the Crown, but not Canada. So we had to sort of figure out and let Canada know that we had our sovereign identity. We didn't want to be a part of Canada, didn't need to be a part of Canada, but here we were now within the boundaries of what became Canada. So there's a lot going on. And of course, as most people probably know, that the Indian Act was the instrument by which all Indigenous people were to be made Canadian, to be assimilated, to be civilized. And the various sexist and racist policies that were put in place by the Indian Act spoke to that. And you know, we could go on about that, but time's already running a little bit short. So, but I just want to, like I said, set the context of her time, Pauline's time. The other interesting thing about this particular photo is if you can read the placard there, this was a campaign stop for Sir John A. Macdonald. So this is a very small window of time in which Indigenous people had to vote post-Confederation. There was because I think most people know that under the Indian Act, that Native people, we weren't civilized or intellectual enough to be able to make sound political decisions and weren't able to vote in elections. Again, it's a whole other story. But for a small window of time, a year or two, around 1870 something, somewhere in there. Sorry, my Canadian history is a bit off. We did have that vote, and Six Nations was always seen as one of the flagship communities in Canada at the time because we were so progressive, let's say. And ironically enough, we were progressive because we had this traditional form of government that was adaptable enough to take care of our community's needs. So this is a bit of a campaign stop. The other thing that people notice is you can see some trombones and trumpets and there's a brass band, a military band at the forefront there. Those were all folks from Six Nations, musicians from Six Nations. We had 3 or 4 marching bands back then, if you can believe that. So there's a lot going on in this particular photo. We don't have time to sort of talk about it all, but again, this would have been something during Pauline's time. And for those familiar with Six Nations, you'll notice too that there's not a lot of trees. There's more trees now than there are in this picture. So there already the deforestation of the reserve was happening. And this was widespread across the province. And the reason this is significant for a couple of things, our environmental landscape had changed, was changing. Even in our time, like I said, we came here in 1784, 1785 after the revolution. We'd allied ourselves with the British, as I'd said, fought against the Americans. We know what happened in the revolution. So the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, were no longer welcome in the States. Some stayed, but a lot of us moved, and about 2,000 people moved in 1785 under the terms of the Haldimand Deed. That's how we came to be along the Grand River. So a lot of things had changed, and deforestation, that's a tough word, had taken a lot of the timber in southern Ontario and the reserve as well a little bit. You can see that happening here. And I think I was just at a talk, somebody had said about by 1890 or 1900, the approximate number, like the approximate percentage of timber that had been cut already in this area was about 90%, which is stunning, really. So it was already underway that, you know, this was people were taking resources off of our lands. And the reason I say this is significant because there was a big campaign during this time on reserve to stop white people, non-native people from coming on the reserve, taking our timber. They would do that at night. Sometimes it would have, they would pay off some native residents for them to come in, but people were trying to stop it. So George Johnson, Pauline's dad, was active in trying to stop this bootleg timber industry. And one night, I guess a couple times, he was beaten so badly by these fellows who were coming in from off the reserve to take timber that he never recovered from his injuries and died as a result of them at one point. And she was just young. She was in her early 20s. And this was a big blow to her. And again, this is kind of what put her she was the breadwinner of the family at that point because of that, because of the death of her father, and her grandfather was gone now. So there's some trauma going on in her young life too. And a lot of the poetry in which she wrote, if you look at it closely with that lens, you can sort of see that happening. So there was, you know, she aspired to be a writer. She had suffered this loss. She had seen these big changes in her community. So these things are significant. Next slide, please. So her first big break, so to speak, came in 1886. So this is the Brant Memorial Monument that is in downtown Brantford, still stands. It was unveiled here in 1886. They say it was it was made from with the cannons from the War of 1812 that were melted down and cast in these images. Brant on top there, of course. It's a really interesting monument. But anyway, at that time, Pauline was already kind of notable for writing poetry and being a Mohawk woman from Six Nations. She was commissioned to write a poem, and something. The poem that she wrote was called "Brant: A Memorial Ode," to be read during the unveiling of this. It was, and for whatever reason, she was not allowed to read her own poem, but it was read by the mayor of Brantford, I believe, a non-native guy. So one could see, okay, is that a gendered thing? Is that a a racialized thing? Who knows? But regardless, she was kind of held silent at that particular event. And be that as it may, or read into that, we don't have to talk about that, or we can later. But I think that's a significant moment that Brantford, the town named for Joseph Brant, and later Burlington too, right? We can talk about that if people want to. There's his connections to Burlington. But Pauline kind of, made a name for herself by writing that poem, but she wasn't allowed to read it. And I dug a little deeper into my own archive, and this is a I don't know whether you can see this on the screen here. Where's my camera? This is a medallion that was handed out or made available to people at this unveiling in 1886. So this is the monument here. You can kind of see that. You can sort of see that's just the image of what we're looking at now. Anyway, bought that off a fella off on the reserve a few years ago before he passed. But there's a few of them around. They turn up from time to time on eBay, so there must have been a fair number of them distributed during that day. But anyway, there's some 100 and, but I did the math, 138 years ago. All right, next slide, please. So this, of course, is the Mohawk Institute that was in existence in Brantford, just about a 30 minute walk from the Brant statue I just showed you. Mohawk Institute was Canada's longest running residential school, established by the Canadian Church and the New England Company. I think by now most people have heard of it and seen it. I can't remember the exact date of this photo, but it's an early one. But the one before this had burnt down. Probably the one that was around in Pauline's time had burnt down, and this was its replacement. So still intact, right? Still to tell the story. But again, this sort of the tension too between assimilation, enforced assimilation, what to do with Native people, what were happening with the children. This is the backdrop of what Pauline was doing. And so, as I said in my book and elsewhere, other people said too, was Pauline an instrument of this? Did she kind of condone this by talking about be sort of very patriotic in the Canadian vision? And she said in many points in her work that, I think at one point, I can't remember which poem exactly, but at one point she said that Canada's greatest Native people are Iroquois allies, right? What's more Canadian than her Iroquois allies or something like that? I'm paraphrasing, but there was a lot of sense of that going on. But again, did she really feel that way, or was she trying to play nice in her own form of reconciliation with not a whole lot of truth, but by making nice, by sort of bringing people together, unifying people as opposed to taking political stances in the opposite direction? Lots to be talked about there. But again, I just want to sort of set a stage for some of her work. Next slide, please. So also, this is an interesting photo, and this is Pauline's dad, second from the left. I'm pointing at my screen, but you can't see that. Second from the left, that's George Johnson sitting there. And that's her grandfather who's standing, John Smoke Johnson. So this is another photo taken in 1871. So little Pauline's 10 years old, running around Chiefswood, being exposed to all of this stuff. And what's significant here is that these wampum belts, see all the various wampum belts that these are all chiefs and interpreters from Six Nations. I think that's Joseph Snow on the left, who was an Onondaga chief at the time, George Johnson to his right, I guess, or his left, our right. And then John Buck, who was the wampum keeper from Six Nations, John Smoke Johnson, as I said. I forget the other guy in the middle, I'm blanking, and then John Seneca Johnson. So anyway, all chiefs and political cultural leaders at that time gathered for a photo shoot with their wampum belts. The significant things about these wampum belts are those are our treaties, those are our documents, those are very almost call them sacred items that our people held. The agreements between us and indigenous, or sorry, non-indigenous peoples and governments. Lots of wampum belts, and we don't have time to get into each and every one of them, but all of them are important. And this was posed at a studio also in Brantford. But the thing I want to point out here really quickly is if you can see the belt that her grandfather's holding, that is the Pledge of the Crown wampum belt. That's significant because it was a wampum belt that was actually given by the British to Six Nations and other Indigenous allies here in Hamilton at Dundurn Park. So at the close of what is now Dundurn Park, Dundurn Heights, I guess it was. So at the close of the War of 1812, right, and Indigenous people, largely Six Nations, but there were other Anishinaabe and other warriors who helped the British at that time, fought for the British. Some debate as to who won that war. The Americans say they did, the British say they did, but what a lot of Indigenous people say is that we know who lost, and that was Indigenous people. The reason being that after that time, our usefulness as allies and things weren't as great as they were in those conflicts. We were now kind of if anything, a barrier in the way the British, at least, to take over land, to take over resources, all that kind of stuff. So we were kind of the victims of what happened there. But again, a whole other story. But getting back to that wampum belt, so that wampum belt was given, I believe, in April of 1815. So about this time of year, whatever, 209 years ago, is that what that is now? And basically that belt, it was given to our people in honor and recognition of our service in the War of 1812, but also importantly, it was an agreement or a pledge. That's why it's called the Pledge of the Crown. It's a pledge of the British Crown that they would always protect our rights. We would always be allies. They would protect our rights and our interests and our lands in Upper Canada at that time. And interestingly enough, this is the photo was taken when John Smoke Johnson rises to talk about just these things. That's significant because in 1871, Canada became a country. The Indian Act was kind of in its early stages. These are done very deliberately. Like I said earlier, photos were taken for a purpose back then, not just because you had an ice cream cone or a nice dinner somewhere. So it was done for a purpose, and our people would have seen it as such, to remind others that these wampums have meaning, and that this is your agreement to uphold these treaty responsibilities and relationships that we still hold. You need to understand and recognize those as well. So these wampum belts would have been the property of the political leadership of the time. And I can't see them too close, but if you look really closely, there's a couple other belts that may or may not have been wampum belts that Pauline also used in that stage costume I showed earlier on. But the Pledge of the Crown is significant because it was, like I said, given at the War of 1812 with its intended purpose, but also that it has a local history, that it was given to our people at what is now Dundurn Castle, about 20 minutes from where I now sit on McMaster campus. So that's significant. But here's another interesting thing. Go to the next slide, please. There's another photo, not so great, but that's a photo of the real belt. Here's a replica. It's called an Irish key. Some say it's a Grecian, or it originates in Greece, but it has a meander pattern or something. But it's something that's been seen before a little bit. But it's an Irish key they talk about. So basically, that's an interlocking thing. Like this thing between us is held fast. It's important. At least the British said that was back in that time. The other thing is, for those, I think a few people in the meeting were at, we had an event here on campus just 2 or 3 weeks ago where we brought this belt out. We actually had the same belt that John Smoke Johnson had in his hand. We had here on McMaster campus about 3 weeks ago. So this thing still exists. It's still very real, and we we talk about that because see, this is the British Crown made this promise, and they continue to break it. Canada has supposedly inherited all these things. They continue to break this agreement of respect and responsibility and friendship between our people and the Crown, and now Canada as well. Next slide, please. But here's where things get fun. So here is a photo, sort of a promotional flyer, I guess it would have been used for, from Pauline a bit later in life here. See, she's the kind of aging poetess at this point a little bit. But notice, and I got a close up of that belt. So basically, from what I can gather, and maybe some people know more about this than me, but this seems to me a colorized photo, like an early Photoshop thing. So a black and white photo, because they didn't have color photos then, and colorized for promotional purposes. So that's why it doesn't look real, but it's not, it's been touched up. But that belt she has, I'm 99.99% sure that that is the Pledge of the Crown belt. That she probably, again, how she got it, how she procured it from her grandfather, her dad, I'm not too sure. It probably shouldn't have been in her hands as an individual, but she had it and she sold it. As I said, she did a lot of things, she had to make money. And so to make money, you have to travel. To travel costs money. At this time, as a single woman, she didn't have a benefactor really. She was kind of on her own, no agent. She did it all. She had to sell this. She sold this belt to George Hay. So George Hay was I forget what he did for a living, but he had a lot of money, and he started up the Hay Foundation. He's one of the first museums about American Indians he had established in New York City. So he was wealthy. He was a collector. He was a historian. He collected a lot of things by Indigenous people, and he had somehow come into Pauline's orbit at that time, and she sold this belt to him to pay for her trip to England, one of her trips to England. I forget the exact date, somewhere around the turn of the century. So that belt was lost to us at that point. That belt that she had and sold wasn't hers to sell, but she did it. But the interesting thing is, folks at Six Nations, Rick Hill, Paul Williams, others who were in the Confederacy, tracked that belt down in later years, and it was what's the word? Reappropriated, I guess, brought back to Six Nations in 2015, just in time for the 200th anniversary of the close of the War of 1812 and the commemoration of that belt. So maybe some of you on the call were in attendance that day, but we in April of 2015 we met on the grounds of Dundurn Castle and talked about this belt again. So although Pauline, her slip up there, her lapse of judgment, some say that she had intended to pay it back, to get it back, and she probably did. But again, it was tough times for her to travel and make money. So maybe she just couldn't, make that payment back. But whatever happened, we did get it back. So that's the good news there. So and that's how it came to be at McMaster campus 2 weeks ago. Next slide, please. So anyway, I just probably should wrap up. Time flies really quickly when you get talking about Pauline and all sorts of stuff. Here's a more recent shot of the Chiefswood mansion estate. Like I said, it's a tourist destination now, and on the banks of the beautiful Grand River. So it's a very sound structure, very regal looking. And it's nice to see that her legacy and his story. And again, I think what I like about Pauline is that she's also very collective. She's an individual poet, as most poets are, but she told a story. She was a proud Mohawk woman with a long ancestry and knew about our history and proclaimed that as much as she could, as best she could, from that stage. During that time, a tumultuous time. And I think the tensions of her life and work, with all the various moving parts happening in the late 19th century, really informed a lot of her, the response that she got, the reaction that she had gotten, and kind of her own ability to maneuver, right? How much does she want to really talk about political things, uncomfortable things? There's a need for that. but there's also a need, like I said, to kind of I don't want to say acquiesce to audiences, but to sell tickets, to not make them feel so uncomfortable that they don't want to come and see her. There's that too. Anyway, I think I'll leave it at that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there's just a final parting shot. Pauline in her canoe on the banks of the beautiful Grand River. So yeah, I just want to, we'll leave it at that. We can have a discussion. I know Jillian has some questions. We want to engage in discussion about this, but for today's presentation, I just want to sort of set the social and political context of her life and times. Because a lot of her poetry we know about, we've read those images. We kind of know her general story, but I want to provide this time a little bit more about the the landscape of when and what she wrote about at that time. So anyway, thanks.
Thank you so much, Rick. That was so fabulous, like really fascinating context about some of those images, and some of the images, the one of Pauline Johnson with the wampum belt are in the archive here. And,
Right.
I didn't know that story about the items, so that's amazing. We've got a couple of questions coming in on the chat, and I've got some questions too that we've talked about. So I think maybe we'll start off with one of mine, and then for audience members, if you have anything that you'd like to ask Rick, please put it in the Q&A section, and we'll see how much we can get through in the next 15 minutes.
For sure.
So Rick, you have a great chapter about Pauline in your book, We Share Our Matters. And I know that you had come into McMaster at that time to do some archival research about her. So I guess I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the things that maybe stood out to you about the archive, or if there were any items that kind of linger in your mind from that collection.
Yeah, I think what always sort of strikes me is a reminder that the collection is a reminder of just how prolific she was, how much she actually did write in various forms, newspapers, magazines, whatever she could sell, right? Essentially. And she recycled a lot of her stories a little bit, put little twists and spins on them. But and that's okay, because I could imagine how difficult it would have been to write, especially if she was traveling and touring. She was one busy lady. And the correspondence speaks to that too. She was like hustling all the time, right? And seemed to be very social. Like she would get fan mail and respond to that. So she has a pretty vast archive of that kind of stuff, but it's like a very prolific. We sort of lose sight of how popular she probably really was. But that's also kind of borne out, I think, by things that we've talked about. Like when I teach her here at McMaster and other places, and I'm in the English department, so I sort of deal with English students much of the time, and you sort of ask them like, name one or two Canadian authors, let's say, from the late 19th century, and almost no one can name anybody really, but Pauline is somebody that everyone's familiar with. So there's that. So she was popular. Lots of editions of her books. She sold pretty well, um, and yeah, quite well known, and so very popular. So that's great. And I think her legacy lives on. And the thing that also strikes me, and the thing that struck me, I'm going to read it because I only took a picture on my phone. When I was there just the other day, in the archive was a magazine that was published, I think, in BC in 1961. So which would have been the centenary of her birth, right? Kind of, assessing the her legacy 100 years after, because she was still quite well known in 1961. But so I just saw this the other day. I took a picture of it. So this is what kind of struck me, though. So that was now 60. Where are we? That's 63 years ago already, from 61. So this is the premier of Ontario at that time, one Leslie Frost. I'm going to read for that if you just indulge me for a second here, because I think it's pertinent to our discussion. So referring to the outstanding quality of her life and work, Premier Leslie Frost said that the homage now being paid to this great daughter of Ontario, quote, marks a further stage in the growth of a feeling of national identity and pride on the part of the people of our country, the development of which was one of the main objectives of Miss Johnson's work. Miss Johnson knew and loved this nation and the beauties of its countryside, but above all, she understood its people. She never forgot her proud Indian heritage. While she wrote of her people and their glories, She did not attempt to conceal their plight in a society which exploited them and which, in the language of today, treated them as second-class citizens. So, 60-something years ago, long before TRC, long before a lot of things that we hear and talk about now in the media, a highly placed political person in Ontario understood that, she did, tremendous work at a time when we need to do better. And I would argue, and I think Pauline would argue, that given all the things that are in the news today, we can't drink water, our women go missing and murdered and all sorts of things. Has things really improved, even though people in Pauline's day in 1961 knew there was issues to be taken up. Residential schools were still alive and well in 1961. He's not addressing those things, but knowing that Indigenous people were second-class citizens even then. So that's what kind of makes her interesting. That's the kind of thing that struck me in this most recent visit to the archive, and there's probably many more. But, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. And I know that's something that that you've mentioned to me before, that you really want to contemporize Pauline Johnson and sort of point out that some of these issues that she was writing about kind of haven't gone away. They're still contemporary issues. So
For
um,
sure.
yeah, and I guess I'll ask maybe one more of my questions, and then we've got a lot coming in the Q&A. But I think there's a nice connection here. Um, so I'm wondering, I guess, when you want to teach Pauline Johnson or talk about her, and really talk about some of this like nuance and complexity in her writing, are there like specific pieces or poems that you might direct people to?
Um, yeah, for sure. I'm just trying to think of some quick ones. One that always comes to mind is for those in a hurry. I think one of her more impactful ones to me anyway is one called The Cornhusker, which I think is a 3-stanza poem referring to an old native lady. You don't even really know the time period, but it talks about this old woman who's emerging out of her dwelling to go pick corn. Very Haudenosaunee thing to do. We have a long history and connection to that, but kind of in the middle of this poem is this woman going out to do this very timeless thing, this very culturally spiritual thing that we've always done that sustained our people. But in this woman's mind, internally, she's thinking about the days gone by and the injustices that her people have experienced. So it's a beautiful little piece that does a lot, and that's what I think one of her more better crafted one. It's not really wordy. It's not even really written for performance so much, but it has a real feeling to it that always lingers with me. Um, the other ones that are pretty kind of hit you over the head, literally, I guess, are like "Cry from an Indian Wife" and um, "The Cattle Thief." Very in your face, kind of, you stole our land. You're murdering her people, shame on you, right? That kind of thing. There's that. So that's not even nuanced, but it's impactful, I think. But one of the ones that I always refer to a lot and talked about in my book a little bit is a short story called Hero's Sacrifice. And this is a really interesting piece because I've noticed it turns up a lot in her short pieces for magazines. She talks about this a lot, and it's around a fairly sensitive cultural practice, a ceremonial practice that our people had engaged with for centuries, right up until about the 1920s, 1930s, 100 years ago. And it's called the sacrifice of the white dog, the burning of the white dog. And it's done at midwinter's time, or used to be, and it's basically a Thanksgiving part. Like this, dogs have always been a big part of our culture, man's best friend even now, but they hold a special place um, in our people's stories. And so this dog was a messenger to the creator to thank him for, the dog runs this message to him. I won't get into it, but there's a lot around that. So Pauline seemed to be very intrigued by this particular ceremony, wrote about it a lot. And on the one hand, and this is kind of very indicative of her position, is she's almost embarrassed by this pagan practice, and she refers to it very like a lot as a pagan practice. But she sees in it a real beauty and a what's the word, a timelessness of how culture persists. If it was that important into the 20th century, it must be something really important. So she's understanding that. She's not being completely critical, but also grappling with what that is all about. and writes about it, and then writes about, always puts in a non-native missionary or priest or archbishop who's ever in attendance to these things, because she has 3 or 4 variations of this theme. And she talks about how this this priest is or a bishop is very taken, this minister is very taken by the level of devotion, I guess, that our people have to our ceremonies and our practices and our customs. And he says something along the lines of, if my own people had this much, belief in their practices, then we'd be a better people too. Something along those lines. She's always kind of, you can't ever tell which way she's tilting. Right, in one paragraph, it's a paganistic ritual. There's no place for it in the late 19th century. But in the next one, she's talking about how great it is and how others should aspire to be that, you know, committed to their beliefs too. Right. So anyway, that's a lot going on there.
Yeah, thanks. Those are some great pieces. And I know something that you say in your chapter is that Pauline Johnson was kind of an enigmatic figure. Like there's still so much to discuss about her. She has that kind of slippery quality. So,
Mhm.
which is really interesting. Um, we've got a great question here, and I'm curious about it. So the person has, yeah, I think, is referencing the photo of Confederacy chiefs with the wampum belts. And this attendee audience question asks, can you speak to the absence of clan mothers, maybe, and matrilineal roles in some of the maybe older pictures and older writings at Six Nations during Pauline Johnson's era?
Mhm. No, that's a great question. Um, yeah, it seems to be that the men were always kind of put forward, and a lot of ethnologists and anthropologists would do that. They understood things from their perspective, right? Because these were non-native guys, let's face it, who had the cameras, who had the resources, who had the capability to make these things happen, make these events, these photo ops happen, I suppose. And probably didn't really, they couldn't really fathom that women would have a role and a voice in these things. The other thing is, when you talk to people at home, traditional people at home, they say, well, and we understood this is kind of baked into our understood, as an understood thing in this time too, that even though those men are up there talking about these wampums, being photographed with them, they were put in place by the women, the clan mothers, kind of behind the scenes a little bit, but it was always understood, especially in those times too, that clan mothers held that power. So those chiefs are only sitting there doing those things because women felt that they were the proper guys to be doing that. And if they weren't, then those women could take away their power and authority as well. So there's that kind of unseen thing, the understanding of how our systems worked back then. So there's that. And there's, there needs to be more research looked into the role of women at that time. And I'm doing some sort of preliminary research on an old manuscript I'm looking at now that talks about that very thing, that there were, even though it was understood that clan mothers were behind these chiefs and the whole structure of that, of the Kanyen'kehà, the Great Law, and the chiefs titles, they weren't front and center in meetings, this and that. So we don't know what took place. We didn't know what the conversations were between clan mothers and chiefs. We only know the council minutes in which the chiefs were speaking on behalf of the clan and the nations. So there's that too. So yeah, there needs to be more work done in that area, but unfortunately, there's not a lot in the written record that we can go by just at this point.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. And I guess kind of related question, something that I have wanted to ask you. So, Pauline Johnson is very well known as a person from the Six Nations community, but are there some other significant Haudenosaunee women who you wish were kind of better known, or who you want to talk about more?
Oh yeah, definitely. A lot of women. I think they're sort of coming in. There's these stories are emerging more recently. Emily General, um, the Jemison sisters, who were all school teachers, essentially, activists. My own grandmother, Edith Anderson Monture, who people may know about. She was born at Six Nations in 1890. She went to, this is the other irony of history, right? So she went to high school in Brantford. She went to day school on the reserve. because we had schools on the reserve. Then she went to Brantford to go to high school, even though 20 minutes away, the Mohawk Institute was operating, and my grandfather was going, my maternal grandfather was going to the residential school there at the same time my paternal grandmother was going to high school because she wanted by her own agency. But then she wanted to be a nurse, but couldn't get into nursing school because she was a Native woman. So she had to go to Buffalo to get her nurse training, and then from there she went to New York City and then on to France with the American Army, because she couldn't do that in Canada because she was a Native woman. Anyway, she went on to fame and fortune later on, and I knew her well. She lived to be 105 years old. Anyway, she's quite well known about in that regard because they have schools named after her. There's a park and a street named after her in Brantford. All of that, but so she's already known about. But we like telling her story, and I guess I can because my grandma. But anyway, but yeah, lots of women. Bernice Loft Winslow. Oh gosh, I'm blank. Why am I blanking on it? She's also a family member, married in Monture family. Oh, Ethel Brant Monture, sorry, an author. Many women who did this work. A lot of it activist work, a lot of it around culture and traditions during this time too. But again, they weren't really accorded a lot of attention because from that during that time, women weren't presented as being front and center in these issues anyway, right? Especially Native women. But it kind of shows the disregard, the indifference that society paid. But Pauline was really good about bringing that forward too. Red Girl's Reasoning, if you lose some of those stories, Red Girl's Reasoning, all sorts of things that she introduced, the strength and the importance of Haudenosaunee women and Indigenous women in general. Kind of gets overlooked in the other canon of stuff, but it's definitely there. So she understood that. She wrote about it too, to the best of her ability.
Thank you so much. That's a great story about your grandmother too. And I think we have time to squeeze in one more question. Someone has asked if there are any books you'd recommend written by Indigenous women about Pauline Johnson.
Trying to think here about Pauline Johnson. Mashana Goldman, who's a professor at the University of Buffalo, she's from Tonawanda. She wrote a book called Mark My Words, which is there's a chapter on Pauline. It's not about Pauline specifically, but there's a great chapter in there about Pauline Johnson. So Mashana Goldman, Goemann, Mark My Words. There's a great chapter in there. As far as book length studies, I can't think of any off the top of my head. But yeah, I know I'm blanking on something. Sorry, I wasn't prepared to answer that kind of question. But yeah, that's a great question. But Mashana's book is great. Oh, Beth Brandt, who was a writer from Kanyen'kehà, wrote a fair amount about Pauline, but not book length studies, chapters and essays. Lee Miracle talks about her. Who's recently passed on, I guess a few years ago now. But anyway, yeah, there's a lot of Indigenous women and writers pay great homage to Pauline as a trailblazer, as a real pioneer spirit in Indigenous writing in general, Indigenous women's work specifically too.
Thank you so much, Rick. That's a great answer, and I appreciate you answering it on the fly. So I think that we are out of time for questions today, but I just want to thank you so much. This was a really wonderful session, and it's going to be a recording for those who are in the audience. It's going to live on the McMaster YouTube channel, so you can revisit this as well. And I'll try to answer any kind of questions in the chat that I can after the fact. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you so much once again, Rick. Wonderful talk. We really appreciate it. Take care.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm happy to do more of these when time allows. But yeah, there's a lot to be taken up here for sure. But thanks for organizing this one.
Great. Thanks.